intro lecture. So I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, myself. I gave you a few clues here. So I went to Bethel, oh man, a while ago, like 12 years ago. Oh, is that right? Yeah, that's when I started. No, more than that. I don't know. I can't do math. Yeah, 12 years ago is when I graduated. Okay. So I went to I went to Bethel, and I was chemistry major. I went directly from Bethel to the University of Minnesota and did a pharmacy degree there. So I have my doctorate of pharmacy. I've been practicing at Abbott Northwestern Hospital for the last 9 years. I did a 1-year residency out of pharmacy school, which is pretty common if you want to go into hospital practice. For pharmacists that go into retail or some other areas, they don't usually do postgraduate training, but for advanced clinical roles, you usually do 1 or even sometimes now 2 years is getting more common for pharmacy. So just like every aspect of healthcare, right? You start where you have a big demand and you can't fill it, and then as things start to get narrow, you start to weed people out by doing advanced training, certifications, and things like that. So anyway, I did 1 year of residency. I practiced. I really fell in love with emergency medicine. And our emergency department practice at Abbott was very collaborative. We were working directly alongside physicians and nurses, and you'd sit kind of in a U-shaped pit with all the other providers. They just bounce questions off you all day, and it was like rapid-fire pharmacy Jeopardy, and that's the kind of stuff I really like. And then you get to go into codes. You got to do education and patients. It was a really cool combination of everything critical care and everything ambulatory care smashed into one. And again, I really liked it. Flash forward like 4 or 5 years later, I decided I wanted to be more involved. I was getting more involved with departmental logistic things, and so I decided to change my career path completely, and now I oversee automation and central pharmacy operations. Sounds super boring. So whenever people ever ask me what I do, I'm like, well, I used to be an emergency medicine pharmacist, and now I manage these stupid machines that are like giant vending machines. Anyway, basically, I'm much more involved with logistics now, so I figure out how we can get medications out and make sure access of medications is easy for the end user. So mostly nursing, but also anesthesia and all that type of stuff, and ultimately impacts you guys, because when you're calling pharmacy and be like, or asking your nurse, why isn't this here? Does pharmacy have it or whatever? That's kind of where I'm involved. So anyway, I have a different role now. I still work a little bit clinically. I work mostly in our mental health area clinically. I dropped the emergency department team mostly for scheduling reasons, not because I didn't like it. But anyway, I live in Plymouth with my wife, Janae. I have 2 kids. These are a year old, but they honestly look pretty much the same, believe it or not. That's Lola in the middle. She still doesn't really have any hair, so we kind of make fun of her for that. And then Elliot is my son. He's almost going to turn 5. Lola's 2.5, and Elliot will be 5 this fall. Okay, Syllabus. The Moodle site is where you'll find everything, including the recordings and the lectures. What I do before exams, and if I don't do this, feel free to shoot me an email and remind me, is I'll post a forum that's sort of like a general question and answer thing. And what I try and do is if you email me a question and you maybe don't feel comfortable posting it in front of the whole class, I will post that question to the forum with my answer to it without your name on it, of course. So like if you know, I'm having trouble figuring out what the difference between a penicillin and a cephalosporin is. Well, if I have an answer for that, I will put it there. Same thing, if you guys have general questions you want to post there, you can post there. It doesn't notify me when somebody posts on Moodle, so I try and have to remember to check it, which I'm bad about doing. So if you're like, it's been 3 days, the test is tomorrow, I still don't have an answer, email me, and that'll be a little reminder to check it. Anyway, the flexibility, again, like I said, I have a 40-hour-a-week job, and so this is kind of my hobby. Some people like go hunting or fishing, and I teach pharmacology, so there you go. But every once in a while, I'll have to cancel class or move a class or something like that, and I try and give notice. I try and plan in advance, but life happens. Work happens. Sometimes I get stuck at something at work, or a crisis happens, and I have to stay beyond the 3 o'clock time slot. So that just is life. So anyway, I'll try and be communicative as much as possible with that and get that out to you guys. Guest speakers, I don't really have many guest speakers lined up. I have one recurring one. He should be here. I think he's going to come either the 9th or the 16th. I can't remember which one, but he's going to do HIV and Hep C. He's a Hep C, like an antiviral specialist at Hennepin County, and he does a really great job with that. It's not a huge part of the exam, and it's super specialized, but he's a good lecturer, and he's interesting content, so definitely worth listening to. Exams are all multiple choice, and they are broken down in your syllabus. As you can see, there is not really much to say about them. They're usually like 40 to 50 questions each, and they're broken up evenly amongst the modules. Cases, I used to do these review cases in class, and people were just telling me they were not using the time wisely and just kind of chatting instead. So I stopped doing that. What I do post are cases to review before every exam, and there usually will be some similarity to the case to some questions on the exam. Might not be word for word. The cases are much more open-ended. They aren't necessarily guiding you to a specific direction, but I will post a case key with some discussion points on it. Sometimes I might do a video to talk about the case as well, but that'll be something that is just sort of rolled into what I consider your participation grade. So I assume you're doing those and showing up to class, and that's what that 10% participation is. So I've never not given anyone 10% participation, so unless you like just decide you're never going to come and, I don't know, do other things that aren't good, you'll probably get those points. Cases, textbook. The textbook, I haven't looked at the updated version in a while. I don't really teach out of the book. I used it to build some of the content and to follow some of the modules, but the book is good in some circumstances. I think for those people who really want maybe more of an in-depth pharmacology review, the book does a little bit better at drilling into the like molecular biology behind how drugs work. I don't really have time to talk about a lot of that. I'll give you a very snapshot of a mechanism of action, but again, if you want more again, detail on that, the book is better for that. I'm not going to test you on it either. So I won't test you on stuff in the textbook that I don't present in my class. So don't worry about that. The book is a recommended ancillary reference. If you bought it and can return it and want to, I won't feel bad about that at all. I pull my content from multiple different sources, from drug monographs to guidelines to different texts, to different lectures I've had throughout my career, to personal experience. So a lot of it's kind of an amalgam of different sources. And any questions? Has anybody reviewed any of the syllabus and look good? Lisa handles all my exams for me, so she'll be your proctor. She'll also do the review sessions too. She probably won't know the content, but she can at least tell you what questions you got wrong. That's just for timeliness, because sometimes I'll have a situation where I'll maybe have an exam and I won't have a class in person for a couple weeks after that, depending on how things fall. And so she can get you results. I'll obviously post and grade the results and have that stuff, but she can get you actually, the e-value released and everything like that, or the e-medley released. So anyway, that's how the exams work from that perspective. All right, so what are we talking about in this course? Drugs, of course. So we're focusing on pharmacology and pathophysiology and how those things merge together. And names, classes, mechanisms of action are kind of the basic language. So if anybody here have a pharmacology course in the past or take something? A couple people? Okay. Anybody here work in pharmacy by any chance? What did you do in pharmacy? Technician?
I was an intern tech for 3 years.
Oh, okay. Cool. So, yeah, those people, be the people you ask questions for. If you're, how do I pronounce this drug again? But it is a different language, so there is a little bit of a learning curve just understanding what we're talking about here. But we cover things sequentially, and it's in conjunction for the most part with clinical medicine, so it should make sense from that perspective. Drug interactions, of course, are key. Adverse drug events or reactions, clinical pearls, disease state synthesis. So this class is called Pharmacology and Therapeutics, and I'll just say it, the emphasis is much more on therapeutics than the pharmacology side of things. So that's ultimately, you guys, it's great if you know the background of all this stuff, and we'll try and get you there as well. But the real thing you need to do is be able to prescribe safely and effectively and appropriately, and you can't do that if you don't know your guidelines and things like that. So that's where I really try and focus my time. Okay. I've got a video here. Oh, I wonder if Jerry Seinfeld finally found this and took it down. Because I don't know if for any of those Seinfeld fans out there, I'll just skip it, but it's the one where he's pretending like pharmacists are better than everybody and they're up high. Anyway, I'm not going to pretend I'm Jerry Seinfeld because I can't deliver like he can. But anyway, if you want to Google that Seinfeld episode, go for it. I think the public perception of a pharmacist generally is that we dispense medications in a retail setting. That's certainly a part of what pharmacy is and what we do, and it's a really important aspect of community health when you think about it. I mean, I can't think of another person with that level of education that you can just literally walk up to and talk to about your health concerns without an appointment, and they actually will respond to you. There's no one else really like that out there that you can just access that well. So pharmacy is one of the most accessible, highly educated health professions we have, and they're a front line for a lot of things. Now, does that mean they can do everything everyone else can? No, I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying that there is a really great value to them. But pharmacy and pharmacists are also in every other aspect and facet of healthcare you can imagine, from insurance plans to clinic and ambulatory care to hospital and everything in between. So there's really pharmacists that have lots of different roles out there. And so I just wanted to say that there are very atypical pharmacists. And my overarching message will be consistently that you should make a relationship with a pharmacist or 2 or 3. Some places you might not have access to a pharmacist. Like in my ED, we have a pharmacist on hand pretty much all times except for overnights. But you might be at a smaller critical access hospital or at a rural clinic setting or wherever you end up to go practice. But that doesn't mean you can't call the retail pharmacist who practices down the street and ask them questions. Almost every pharmacist that's gone through pharmacy school within the last close to 20, 25 years has a PharmD or a Doctor of Pharmacy. So we do get a fair amount of clinical education, despite the fact that not all pharmacists actually use the clinical education on a daily basis. They still should be able to answer kind of the general questions you might have. Good question. Did Just Tonder do her lecture? She still do that? You guys know what I'm talking about? Okay, she talked about a lot of this stuff, so I'm not going to rehash that. So the science of what we call pharmacotherapy and the science of pharmacology and how it all mixes together. So where we get the building blocks from what we're going to talk about through this class comes from a couple different concepts. So first of all, there's medicinal chemistry, which are structure-activity relationships. It's how a compound specifically is designed to interact with something in the body. That's really all there is to it. So you develop, you're a drug developer, you develop this novel compound that you think will interact with, let's say, a beta receptor in the heart. Now, what it does with that beta receptor, you don't really know at that point. And that's what pharmacology is about. It's like, how does the physiologic response to the medicinal agent? So as a drug developer working in medicinal chemistry, you probably have an end goal for what you want your molecule to do, but it might not actually get there. That's what pharmacology is a science of, is how those molecules actually produce physiologic responses. So let's say that specific drug antagonizes that beta receptor, aka it's a beta blocker. It blocks it. So that means it decreases the heart rate. Your heart rate can't get elevated as fast. Therefore, you get decrease in blood pressure and decrease in pre and after load and things like that in the cardiovascular system. So what good is that? Well, that's where pharmacotherapy comes to play, and it takes into consideration the pathophysiology of a disease state, the pharmacology of a pharmaceutical compound, and merges them together. So you have the idea that, okay, well, we have people with high blood pressure out there, or people have heart failure. We give them a beta blocker, it decreases their blood pressure, or it decreases the work their heart has to do. Therefore, their heart can remodel and doesn't continue to go into a failed state. And so that's where we're going to focus most of our efforts for this course. Where do drugs come from? Drugs come from a lot of different sources. The only point of this, I think it's interesting that so many drugs are actually derived from natural products. There aren't as many out there that are totally synthetic as you might think. I mean, you're looking at maybe a third. But the vast majority of drugs have some sort of basis on natural products, or at least basis on an endogenous substrate. So it's kind of cool that most of it is identified in sources in nature and things like that. Here's one example I always like to do. Byetta is kind of an older medication now, exenatide, but there's a bunch of ones in its class. They're called GLP-1 agonists. They're for diabetes. They're getting really popular. When they first came out, they weren't used all that much, but the evidence is kind of swinging back in their favor. But this was identified from a molecule from the Gila monster, the Mexican beaded lizard, and it produces a venom, and that was actually where this product was isolated from. So poisonous plants and animals are great things to isolate and see if you can figure out if you can make a drug out of it. So anyway, we're going to talk about big pharma a little bit, the dark side. Whenever one of my friends goes and ends up working for like a drug company, we always say they're going to the dark side. So it's kind of the funny truth of it. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm actually kind of jealous sometimes that they get to work from home in their sweatpants half the time. So that's pretty cool. So this is, I couldn't find an updated version of this. Medscape publishes a list every year that they compile from some of their resource, but I found an article on it, and they basically were like, chemotherapies are increasing in sales. But anyway, this is the best I've got for you. But I think it's interesting to look at the trends year to year and see what's changing and how much money we're spending on certain drugs. So for example, one I like to point out is Harvoni, which is a hepatitis C treatment. Didn't exist in 2012, and by 2016 it was a $10 billion a year treatment. So that's crazy. Now, what that doesn't take into consideration is how much money we were spending on hospitalizing patients in advanced end-of-life care for hepatitis C patients before we had curative therapy, which we basically do now. So George is going to talk a lot more about those, but it's kind of cool to see how the market shifts and how you get these massive drugs that come on out of nowhere that have huge implications to the costs and overall expenditures that we have in healthcare today. A lot of these medications like Enbrel, Humira, Remicade, those are all for autoimmune diseases, specifically like Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis. and they're just really expensive. Those are what we call biologic agents. They're large molecules, they're proteins, so producing them is a lot more difficult in a laboratory setting than it would be to like mass produce metoprolol or metformin or some sort of small molecule drug that you can synthesize easily and mass produce and put into a tablet. These drugs can't be put into tablets. They're injected for the most part, either IV or sub-Q. And so that whole process in and of itself and packaging that, stability and all those things, you pay for it. So that's where a lot of the current therapies are moving. We're seeing a lot more activity around those biologic agents. I think when they first came out, we're like, gosh, these are so expensive. Is it really worth treating somebody with rheumatoid arthritis with one of these biologic agents when we have older small molecule drugs that are really cheap that kind of work? And turns out, yeah, it actually is worth spending the money on these people and giving them the more expensive drug for the most part. Again, we'll get to that when we talk about RA and Crohn's and things like that. But the point is that we spend a lot of money on certain subsets of medications. The flip side of this is common prescriptions. So you have, and again, I don't know where exactly Medscape I think is a pretty reliable resource personally, but I don't know where exactly they get their medication data from. There are other sites out there, like I think it's pretty notorious that hydrocodone and acetaminophen with brand name Vicodin or Norco, common pain medication, right? The enemy, opioids are the enemy right now, of course, in public, and for good reason, they kind of are. But the fact that that's a number 4 prescription in the U.S. is a little bit staggering, and some sites say it's the number 1 prescribed medication. I don't really buy that, but I mean, if you assume like every person post-op gets some sort of short-acting narcotic, maybe that's true. But you see these medications, they're all pretty generic. As far as they don't have brand names, they're off patent, they're relatively inexpensive. So a lot of the medications we're prescribing more frequently are things like lisinopril and metoprolol, which are blood pressure medications or heart medications. Amlodipine is a BP med. Metformin is the most common med for type 1 diabetes, or type 2 diabetes, excuse me. Albuterol inhalers, they're gabapentin for neuropathic pain. So you have lots of things that are actually relatively cheap when you look at volume of scripts. But then if you look at the amount of money they cost, these have lower volumes, but they're so expensive. Like a course of Harvoni, I think is like $100,000 or $200,000, so it's pretty pricey. But you aren't taking Harvoni for life. You're taking it for 1 or 2 years, whereas you might be on lisinopril for your entire life. So there's a different strategy towards pricing their medications when the drug companies are putting these things in market. This is Express Scripts per member. Express Scripts is a pharmacy benefit manager, and so they work with insurance companies per member per year spending on top 10 therapy classes, commercial plans in 2008. So you have inflammatory conditions. Again, that's all those biologic agents that are responsible for this massive amount of money. Diabetes is just really common, and a lot of the newer diabetic therapies that we're actually finding are pretty decent compared to some of the older ones and maybe more beneficial long-term, causing more weight loss, less cardiovascular side effects, things like that, are taking more hold. So insurance companies are paying for them more often, so we're seeing an uptick in diabetes expenditure. Then you have insulin, too. Insulin in general is expensive, and I think maybe you're living under a rock, but that's a big thing in the news right now where people are like, insulin's really expensive. Amy Klobuchar's kind of made it her stump speech for her presidential bid, and she's been working, lots of people have been trying to get legislature passed to lower drug prices. And diabetes and insulin costs have kind of become the forefront of that. They've become sort of the poster child for why does this cost so much? And it's kind of true. I mean, most insulins haven't changed and been around on the market for, a couple of decades, and they've gone up exponentially in price. Why? They aren't any different. They aren't any better than they were 20 years ago, but that's the reality we face. I mean, some inflation's to be expected. This is a little excessive. Okay, so how do we get drugs to the market? Drug discovery, the goal is to find a product that's both safe and effective. You start with preclinical testing, lab animal testing, and then you submit an investigational new drug application. You move into phase 1 clinical trials. Phase 1 is people who are healthy. Usually I think of like a college student as being a key phase 1 volunteer. Usually they pay you some small amount of money to be part of these. This basically, it's a little risky. You gotta hope the monkey data holds up in humans, right? So it takes some healthy volunteers. It's usually a pretty small amount, so like less than 100. You study the side effects and the safety profile and also the kinetics in those patients. So you make sure the drug, you don't have to take it 5 times a day. That's one of the goals. You want it like a once a day or twice a day medication, ideally. Side effects are minimal, if non-existent, in the healthy population. If no apparent or unacceptable toxicity, you proceed to phase 2. Phase 2 is a short study, or a shorter, smaller study than phase 3, but it's a little bit larger than phase 1. So it's about 50 to 300 patients, and it's focused on efficacy. So now you're taking that drug from your phase 1 trial that you think is relatively safe, and you can give it at a dosing interval that's not atrocious. So again, once, twice, maybe 3 times daily at most, ideally. And you're putting it in patients who actually have that disease and trying to treat them with it and see how they respond. If you get good evidence from phase 2, you move on to phase 3, which are a large-scale study. So if you read like New England Journal of Medicine and they publish something, probably going to be a phase 3 study if it's a new drug coming out. So these, again, are pretty large. It does depend on the population you're trying to treat. If it's a, what's a good example? Like a pulmonary hypertension medication, which is kind of a rare disease, that's not going to have a huge phase 3 clinical trial. It's AFib, like we just had all these new anticoagulants come to market like 5-6 years ago. And they were all tested in AFib patients. AFib is a really common disease. There's tons of people out there with it. So those studies had like 10,000 patients in them. So that's what you really want, is a large pool of people, especially if I'm a researcher, because if I have more people in my study, I can detect subtle differences statistically. And that's where you can show a better advantage to your drug. If you can say, statistically speaking, my new anticoagulant is as effective as the gold standard of therapy, which is warfarin or Coumadin. And it's also showing to be maybe a little bit safer and cause lower bleeding risks than that. So anyway, that's what the goal is, to replicate those results from phase 1 and 2. You want to show that your product is safe in a large group of people and effective in a larger group of people. After that's all done, you can submit an NDA, which is a new drug application. The FDA has 60 days to decide whether or not it can be reviewed, how complete it is, if they want the drug company to pull more evidence or say, okay, did you look at it in this subset population? Or, people with AFib oftentimes have kidney failure. What about renal adjustment? Does it need that type of dosing? So they'll come back and have them analyze that. And sometimes they have to go back and do another study to really get their drug to market. Don't act on the NDA within 6 to 10 months, depending on priority. This whole process takes about 10 years or so for a drug. It's not quick. It does depend on what the medication is. And I'm talking about like in the lab developing compounds to the final product. So the whole time frame. So as you get further along in the process, your percentage of your molecule getting to market goes exponentially down. So let's say you start with 100 drugs to start with, and then maybe you get 10 of those to phase 1, 2 of those go to phase 3 or phase 2, and then maybe 1 of those goes to phase 3 and gets approved. Yeah.
One of the other things that's come up in the news lately is making experimental drugs available to terminally ill patients.
Yep, that's a great point. So that's one thing, is that there's some newish legislation that allow people who do have like terminally ill cancer patients specifically, if there's something that's being tried, they might be able to access it under a compassionate policy, even though it's not approved.
What phase would that take them out of?
Yeah, it could be any real phase. As long as the molecule exists in some phase, I think they can apply for it. So if maybe it's in phase 1 and they're saying, well, this is promising for this, but we really don't know. Or it looked really good in animal models, but we still don't know. They're like, well, I'm going to die in 6 months. Can I try it? Yeah.
So that could potentially accelerate the whole cycle, or would it still have to go?
It can. I don't know how they collect that. It's because it's really just, if you think about it, maybe a couple data points here and there. I don't know if you get enough people through that process, but certainly if it happened to line up with the clinical trial, they could maybe enroll them. But the enrolling has to usually be randomized and blinded too, so that might have bias associated with it. And the study person might say, well, this person's terminally ill and going to have like a 6-month life sentence. I don't know if I want to put them in there because that could be a check against my mortality and then ultimately not look as good in the long term. So there's some complications there. But yeah, overall, there's more access now than there used to be. And the FDA does have a fast track program too. So if there is like, let's say, what's a good example? Like Ebola, if the Ebola thing kind of blew over, but let's say, it came to the U.S. and it was a big deal or something. I don't know. Or post-apocalyptic. Maybe let's get even worse here. Maybe there's like a super flu that wipes anybody out. Anybody ever read The Stand by Stephen King? Something like that. Let's say there's a new promising antiviral that's specific for that strain of the flu, or a new vaccine that stops that strain of the flu from being as effective or as detrimental to the human life. Whatever. I'm losing my train of thought here. But you get the point. If you have a drug like that in the hopper, you could maybe push it through the FDA process faster if there's a sense of urgency behind that. If there's people actively dying, if the disease is something that we need to control quickly, they can access those experimental things quicker and don't have to go through the same rigmarole that they would for, like, if you're coming out with a new medication for hypertension, No one cares. We have enough. There's always opportunity for something new, but good luck. That's all I have to say. All right. So what if it's not a new drug? There's also ANDAs, which are abbreviated new drug applications. This is for approval of a generic equivalent. So once a drug goes off patent, drugs get about 20 years once they start the process. So let's say you start your drug on day one and get it patented. By the time it gets through clinical trials, you've lost 10 years of that patent. So then in the 10 years you have to market, you jack up the price so you really get your money back. That's the whole concept behind why pharmaceuticals are so expensive, is because that research, remember we investigated 100 molecules to start with, now we're down to one. We need to not only pay for that one's research, we need to pay for all the billions of dollars we invested in the other ones. Now, not saying drug companies don't make tremendous profits, and I'm not going to get into that really too much, but that's the whole thing, is that it is expensive to make drugs, and the U.S. makes more drugs by a lot. We make the lion's share of drugs in the world. So that's why I think our country has a more complicated relationship with drug pricing than if you go to Europe and look at how they negotiate drug pricing. Anyway, it's a bit of a different topic. I'm kind of getting off tangents now, but we'll come back to that a little bit. So anyway, if you want a generic drug and you want to make a generic drug, you have a couple options. So if you're a generic manufacturer, you can put in a ANDA. And basically what that is saying, I'm going to make this drug in this pill that's the exact same molecule as the one that was the brand product, and now I'm going to submit it for testing. And what you have to do is prove that kinetically it's similar. So it moves through the body the same, it gets metabolized the same. The reason being is that if your pill and the way you package that medication in an oral dosage form slightly differs from the brand product, because you don't have access to everything that they put in their pill per se, and you might make a pill with different excipient ingredients, which are things that aren't active. So let's say you have a 100 milligram metoprolol tablet and you put it with lactose, which is a common binder. Maybe the drug company that made it didn't put it with lactose, they put it with something else, who knows. But anyway, the point is that you want to make sure that 100 milligrams of metoprolol absorbs the same way and gets into systemic circulation as it would with the brand product. What you don't have to do as a generic manufacturer is prove that your product is effective, because that's already been done by the drug company that invented the product. So that's why it's abbreviated. You just have to prove safety and the same kinetic profile of it, which is usually pretty easy to do if you're a reputable manufacturer. The tricky thing is finding drugs that are profitable. So when you're making generics, you really want to look for those windows of opportunity where no one else is making that, or there's only one person on the market doing that drug. Get involved with that, and then you can be some competition on the market. Generics aren't always cheap. Sometimes, like I just said, you might have one or two companies out there making one drug, and other times you might have 10 companies making one drug. There's lots of different variability within it. I don't know who here fills prescriptions regularly. I'm not going to ask any questions about what you take, but you might have noticed that sometimes, or maybe we've taken care of parents or elderly ones, that they switch what the pills look like occasionally. That's because we pretty much want whatever's cheapest. So like in the hospital, one week we might get something from a drug company in India, one week we might get it from New Jersey. It doesn't matter as long as it goes through the same FDA approval process for a generic. It should be the same thing in the product, theoretically. Now, does FDA have the power to oversee all of that at once? Or do they have the manpower, I should say? No, but we assume that they're kind of doing their due diligence, I guess. Biosimilars. Biosimilar is a new term that came out a couple years ago. Those really expensive biologic agents, like for inflammatory disease that I was just talking about, those don't really have a generic option because of the way that they are made as proteins. That they kind of are just regulated differently than a small molecule drug. So there's something called biosimilars, which allows companies to make basically the same product, brand it slightly differently. The problem with these are, and it's not really a problem, it's just the nature of them, they're expensive to make. So even if you get a generic of it, you might save 20% of your cost, but let's say, comparatively speaking, like have you guys heard of Crestor, cholesterol medication? Crestor was a blockbuster brand name for many years. It went generic 2 years ago, I think. And Crestor is like a tenth of the price of what it used to be. So when you get a small molecule drug that goes off patent, you usually see massive cost savings. The point in me talking about this is just with biosimilars, you aren't going to see that same margin change. You might see a little bit of money difference, but it might be instead of $1,000 a month, it's now $800 a month. So still expensive, but a little bit more cost effective. OTC medications usually started as a prescription or were grandfathered in from a long time ago, like aspirin, for example. And then later they get moved to OTC status. So like one of the recent examples I would think of are the over-the-counter GERD medications or heartburn meds like Prevacid, Prilosec, and what's the other one? I don't know, some other one I can't think of. No, that's a different class. That's been good point, but that's been generic for a little while longer. These are PPIs or protein pump inhibitors, and 3 of them all went generic recently. They basically say that, hey, look, these drugs have been used in the general population for a decade or more. They're safe. There's really no long-term reported side effects, which isn't actually true for those medications. But anyway, they allowed over-the-counter use of them because generally speaking, if you take them as directed, which is like to only use a 2-week supply and not take them longer than that, which absolutely nobody adheres to, they take them for life. But if you only took them for 2 weeks, yeah, there's virtually no risk with them. So yeah, they have these standards that they have to meet to be applied for OTC. There's some other standards too for things like behind the counter, which usually are something that you can get without a prescription from a provider, but maybe with the consultation of a pharmacist. It's rare, but there's states adopting it more often. Like Oregon allows pharmacists to prescribe or to dispense birth control without a prescription. I think Wisconsin actually just passed something like that too, or maybe they're looking at that. So there's a couple of things like that are getting more common, just to get access to those medications that are, there are safety checks we want to make sure we have, but at the same time, people are willing to go through the extra training to be able to dispense them, and it's probably a good thing from a public health perspective. Sudafed's another one that's behind the counter in Minnesota. That's because people make meth out of it or used to make meth out of it. And if you buy a whole bunch of it, you could make meth apparently. And in this case, if you have to like log your ID and stuff. So that's become a behind the counter medication in Minnesota for that reason. So that status is a little bit different. It's basically OTC with a little bit of a restriction in front of it. Vitamins, minerals, supplements, natural products. I'll do a separate lecture on this at some point. It's the moral of the story is that the FDA has no regulatory authority except if somebody reports one of these products as dangerous, then they can investigate and shut the company down. But they don't regulate the industry. So when you buy a vitamin off the shelf, there's usually no one who's checking to make sure what you're taking is actually in that pill. So just some food for thought. Okay, so again, 1 in 10 drugs that go through the up to phase 2 clinical trials will actually make it to market. So it's really a small percentage. Failure rates are rising, and the FDA sometimes will just say, we don't really need a drug like that anymore, or this drug is too similar to what's on the market, or it's more dangerous than alternatives, so they might shut somebody down. A lot of times drug companies do this Me Too concept where they look at a current drug that's on the market and they make a very similar analog to it and get it approved as a competitor. And in that case, it's like, well, which one's cheaper? Which one are we going to go with? They're basically the same thing. They do the same thing in the body. Yeah, so this is old data, but it kind of shows what drug companies put out. So the number of drugs they approved and about how much they spent in millions in R&D for those time periods. So quite a bit. And that's not changing. That's at least getting worse. At least drug companies aren't coming out with more drugs. The pipeline's drying up a little bit as far as what we have. Where we're expanding more is on the biologic side and some of the chemotherapy and advanced immunologic therapies as well. I talked about U.S. pricing a little bit. What I'll just say is one of the rationale for if you ever heard of the pricing bubble and why people are like, it's a hot political topic right now, so I think it's relevant. But some companies, most companies in fact, I think every company in the world except the U.S. negotiates their price. So the drug company says, all right, we'll sell you Crestor at this price, and say, nope, you can sell us Crestor, but it's going to be a third of what you just said. And they're like, well, I want to sell them Crestor, so I guess I have to go with them. So the governments in a lot of countries regulate how much a drug company can charge for a single medication. The U.S. does not. And so what the drug companies justify this bubble where U.S. drugs are so much more expensive than others is because they need to make up their R&D costs. And if every company regulated pricing like, let's say, the European Union does, they wouldn't make enough money and their research would get collapsed, basically. So that's their threat to the U.S. economy is saying, well, we're a big money maker. We have a lot of jobs. We have all this stuff. And if you're going to cut our pricing, you're going to lose jobs. We're going to ship them overseas. We're going to do other things. So there's a lot of political threatening there, I think, and it's complicated for sure. And there's good things, there's pros and good arguments on both sides, but at the same time, there's got to be a middle ground somewhere. People, come on, let's work it out. So hopefully, in our lifetimes, we'll see some changes there because it's really not sustainable at this point, and I think it's rearing its head in the political world now. So I think we're going to maybe see some changes in the next few years. We'll see. They have a lot of money and they spend a lot of money on lobbying and advertising too. So direct-to-consumer advertising, the U.S. and New Zealand are the only countries in the world that DTC, and that is why we allow that. I have no idea. I don't know who sees a drug on TV and decides to go talk to their doctor or PA about it, but I suppose it happens. One thing that's kind of good about DTC is that you can have a conversation with somebody. So maybe somebody sees something, I don't know. What's a good one? Okay, let's say they see a Cialis commercial, right? Let's use a fun drug. Okay, so you see a Cialis commercial and you're like, man, I think I could get some Cialis. I'm going to talk to my doctor and say, yeah, I might have erectile dysfunction. Can I get this? And they're like, well, let's check your blood pressure. And they find out you have super high blood pressure and a bunch of cardiovascular problems. So anyway, that's one example. But it does maybe get the conversation rolling, and I think that's why the drug company is justified, is it's like, oh, we're having an open public health conversation. Yes and no. Other companies do it differently, where they allow drug companies to advertise, but not their products. So like you could advertise screening for high cholesterol as Crestor, but you couldn't associate Crestor with that specific advertisement. So you can do a public health campaign, and then you can advertise on the back end and talk to physicians and prescribers about it, but you can't exactly advertise for that drug. So it's similar but different in other countries. All right. Again, I just wanted to point this out. The U.S. makes the most drugs. This is new drugs that come to the market as far as research goes. Generic manufacturing is totally different. A lot of that's made overseas. There's tons of generic manufacturing in China and India, and on the east coast of the U.S. there's a lot of manufacturing, especially in New Jersey for some reason. All right, new drug research goals. What's the future look like? Genomics is something that kind of it's talked about here and there. Basically, the idea is looking at somebody's genome and being able to say, okay, you have these specific genes that either metabolize drugs differently or maybe receptors work differently in your body. So this drug might work better for you in this class of medications than this one. We haven't really gotten there yet with a lot of things. There's a couple of good applications to genomics, which we'll talk about, but it's a little far off in the future. And of course, people aren't going in and readily getting their genomes fully transcribed, so we don't really know that. I mean, the technology is there, sort of. It's just we aren't really there as a health system. Magic bullets, the idea that you have a drug that only does what you want it to and doesn't cause a side effect. That's perfect, but very little drugs actually do that. So that's the better approach to it. What do we have for current therapies, and can we make those more safer for people, and also at the same time without losing any efficacy compromise or even gaining efficacy? X-ray crystallography, if you took inorganic chemistry at some point in your career, you know what I'm talking about. Computer modules, that type of stuff. Advanced modeling technology to look at receptors and interactions to try and map drug targets. Make things that bind tighter or get more response with lower dosage and possibly better side effect profiles as well. Large database screenings, as far as research, it's a really common research target to look at like a big group of people. So maybe you have access to Medicare's database and you say, all right, 20 million people in the Medicare database take lisinopril, and this many people had this, blood pressure results with it, compared to this many people took amlodipine and had this blood pressure on that. So you can kind of do some comparisons there. So that's where we look at a lot of data as far as what's the best therapy. Talked about biologics, talked about Me-Toos. A lot of times what you'll see too with more active enantiomers is a drug will get rebranded with a different enantiomer. So they might have citalopram, which is an antidepressant, brand name Celexa, was a popular one for a while. And then when it lost its patent, the company just like, hey, look what I got in my back pocket. I've got S-citalopram, which is the S-active enantiomer, which is a slightly more active product of it. It's pretty much the same thing. You can dose it a little bit differently, maybe a little bit more potent, but at the same time, this happens a lot. So they'll come out with that enantiomer conveniently right when their patent's about to come out. Orphan drugs, if you've heard of that concept, orphan drugs are basically drugs designed for diseases where there's not a lot of research, there's not a high amount of people who have the disease, and it's not like you're treating blood pressure or diabetes. It's like you're treating some odd form of cancer or something that's just not within the mainstream. That's what an orphan drug is. So when you hear about orphan drug funding and things like that, that's important for those few people who have those types of diseases. So in case you're curious what that means. So how does this affect you? Generic substitution is really important. So most states have laws like this. Minnesota has a law. If you write a brand name on a prescription, which most people don't handwrite prescriptions anymore, but let's say you did, and you write Celexa, and you send that to the pharmacy, they'll automatically fill generic citalopram for that. Unless you put DAW, which means dispense as written, they'll fill the generic name. If you put DAW on a Celexa script, they're probably going to call you and ask you why you did that, because why would you dispense brand name Celexa? Sometimes it's hard to find brand names of stuff, so be really careful if you have a patient saying, oh, I can only take brand of this. You're like, well, why is that? Have you tried a bunch of different ones? Oftentimes they might, if they can try a different manufacturer, maybe they claim there was a dye allergy or I don't know, something had too much lactose in it and they're lactose intolerant. I don't know. You hear all kinds of different things. Who knows how much of it is placebo versus actually a real concern. So sometimes just maybe say, well, this pharmacy might have a different manufacturer. Let's call and see, instead of prescribing a really expensive brand name product that might not even exist anymore. Prior authorizations are required by prescribers and pharmacies to authorize insurance coverage of brand name medications that aren't on their formulary. So let's say you prescribe new brand name hypertension medication that's super popular. The insurance says, no, I'm not going to pay for that unless you prove to me that they need it. Then you have to fill out paperwork to say that that patient has tried these different antihypertensive, they aren't working, and that's why you need to be on this one. So it's usually not terrible, but it does delay it a little bit. So it's always good, especially if you work in a hospital practice, if you have somebody discharging or discharge coming up and they're on something brand name that you started, you really want to make sure that that's going to be covered before the day of discharge. Because we've actually had that happen where people sit in the hospital waiting for insurance coverage. So we try and be proactive about that, but certainly keep that in the back of your head. With the outpatient world, it's not quite as big of an issue because you can wait a few days usually before starting a medication. But anyway, just so you guys are aware of that, that usually takes a couple days to get those processed. Pharmacy pricing. Why do pharmacies charge $12 for a bottle of Tylenol that costs nothing? Well, because it takes money to I always say that it costs like, what, $10, $15 to run an empty bottle through a pharmacy. So if you had a pharmacist fill a blank prescription, check your profile, you had a technician pull the drug, pretend to count it, label it, put it in a vial, the pharmacist double checks it, dispenses it to you, all that costs money and time. So even if your drug is pennies on the dollar as far as what it actually costs physically, it's still going to cost something to run that through a pharmacy. So that's why you see those costs associated with it if you're paying cash. Some places will do like the $4 generics or whatever it is, and those places can afford to take a hit. They're losing money every time they dispense a drug like that, but they make it up on other ends, so that's their logic there. Mom and pop pharmacies or independents generally don't do that because they literally can't afford to charge those kind of prices to people. They'll lose money too much. And drug shortages. Drug shortages are the ever-ending, never-ending cycle of pain that I deal with on a fairly regular basis, is that companies just stop making a product, or they can't get raw materials, or a batch fails. Like maybe the biggest manufacturer of hydromorphone or Dilaudid in the country failed batch inspection, and now it's going to be 2 months before we get any Dilaudid, which is our most common agent we give like post and preoperative for opioid use. That happens a lot. Or maybe a hurricane hits a factory in Puerto Rico and wipes out all your sterile water, normal saline and dextrose supply. Weird. Yeah, we can't get diluent. That happened to us a couple of years ago with the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. We had plenty of drug. We didn't have anything to mix it with. So stuff like that happens, and you just got to roll with the punches. So just it's a common. It honestly, I don't remember it ever existing when I was a pharmacy tech and in a pharmacy intern even. Drug shortages weren't really an issue every once in a while, and now we talk about them every week as far as what's on shortage, what do we have to substitute, how do we get around these shortages. So it's definitely become a big deal. All right, generic substitution, I talked about this already. I don't think I really need to talk about it anymore. It's there for you. The excipients, I'll just say this because this gets to be a more common thing. Lactose and gluten are the two ones that will probably come up as somebody, well, I'm lactose intolerant, and are there lactose in medications? The vast majority of pills have lactose in them. Now, is it enough lactose to cause a reaction? Probably not. If somebody's taking like 20 meds a day, maybe. But generally speaking, they've done studies on this, and it's a little bit variable as far as what the data is. But there aren't really good alternatives. You're either going to take the pill, or you have to find another thing that's not a pill. Most pills will have lactose, so you maybe look at liquid formulations, or maybe intramuscular, transdermal, topical stuff, but not everything has an alternative. You might be stuck with what it is. So sometimes you just gotta tell them to suck it up. Gluten is a little bit different. There is a website, I think, called glutenfreedrugs.com, which sounds sketchy, but it's actually pretty legitimate. And it has a pretty good database on drugs that don't have gluten in them. Most of them don't, just as a FYI. I talked about insurance coverage, PAs already. You can skip that slide. I already talked about this stuff. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, I had a professor in college or in pharmacy school that liked to quote himself. So I'm going to quote him today. He says, "A drug that is the one that cannot afford is neither safe nor effective." Very true, right? If you can't pay for your medication, your patient's never going to pick it up, never going to take it. So how do you know it did anything? So it's really important to actually think through the economics of this and how patients can actually get the medication. Do they have insurance coverage? Will they be able to pay for this medication out of pocket? What's their copay? Those are all things that you won't know when you prescribe it, but it's something to make sure you're having an open dialogue about your patient. Be like, well, this new inhaler I want to put you on, not an alternative for it. It can be kind of expensive, so let me know if your insurance doesn't pay for it, something like that. Just so that they know they have a way back to you if they don't feel totally lost, if they're stuck with a $300 bill or something like that. Controlled substances. We'll talk about controlled substances at various intervals during the course. The general thing is just to know what they are as a prescriber, know which medications are controlled. There are prescribing differences. For example, you can't do refills on a C2. You can do a 6-month worth of refills for a C3 through C5. There's a prescription monitoring program called the MNPMP, which I've got linked there. Really handy. As any provider, you need to sign up for it. You can run a list in this database and see what controlled substances somebody has filled within the last, I can't remember how far it goes back. It goes back quite a ways. But like you could see if somebody, like maybe they're coming to your urgent care and they're like, I'm out of my pain meds, I need a refill or whatever. And you're like, I don't really trust this person, or I'm not really sure, I don't know this person. And that's okay. It's okay to be skeptical, especially when it comes to dispensing narcotics. I would always check this. It doesn't take a lot of time. You just have to type in their name and date of birth and it'll give you their dispense history. It's also multi-state. So if somebody's here from Wisconsin, those Wisconsin people, I don't know, coming here to get narcs. Yeah. So they're on vacation and trying to get their Percocet refilled from you. You can go in and look at these different databases in different states, and you can see, wow, this person gets their Percocet filled every month on the nose. That looks pretty legit. They're taking it for some reason. I'm not really going to clinically assess that at this point, not disrupt the apple cart too much, but it looks legitimate. Or you see, wow, this person's doctor shopped 5 different doctors and pharmacies in the last 3 months and gotten this many quantity, and what are they taking it for? Well, you've gotten, and you can go and nicely say, well, I see you've gotten 300 Percocet pills in the last 3 months. What have you been using them for, or what have you been taking them for? And I don't feel comfortable prescribing at that level of pain management. So certainly there's ways to get around that, but be careful, because this stuff does come back to bite pharmacists, comes back to bite prescribers too on dispensing. It's sort of in our legal definition that we have to be able to use our judgment to discern when people are trying to dupe the system. And if you're caught complicit in that, even if you weren't necessarily, you could get in trouble potentially. I don't want to scare people. I don't know anybody personally who ever has, but it does come up in the news occasionally where people, usually they're pretty egregious, right? They're kind of way over line, but still something to consider. If you're wondering about these drug shortages and what is on shortage, ASHP is the American Society of Health System Pharmacy, and they have a shortage list. So you can type in a drug name and see if it's on shortage. Be like, why did my pharmacist change my medication from this to this when I ordered it? Well, we have an auto sub policy because that's on shortage, and this is the alternative. Too bad you don't get a choice. We literally don't have the drug. Sorry. You wouldn't be surprised how many people come back and are like, we'll find it. What am I supposed to do? Like magically make drug out of thin air? I don't know. Some people just don't get it. Not PAs. PAs are great. It's the surgeons. Okay. Economic implications. So sometimes you end up with something that just really costs a lot of money because some company figures out that they're the only company that makes this product and they're going to charge through the nose for it. Everybody probably is familiar with Martin Shkreli, you know who that is, maybe. He was like, they called him like the bad boy of pharmacy or whatever, I don't know, it just seems like a total idiot. He was like a financial guy of some kind, but anyway, he bought a company, drug company, and they bought the patent on this drug called Daraprim, which is a really rare drug used for HIV-acquired infections. So people with HIV, it's uncontrolled, they can acquire certain fungal and viral infections. Anyway, there's a treatment for that. And it's rarely ever used, but he bought it and he took it from like a $10 a pill product and charged like $700 a dose for it. There's nothing illegal about doing that, believe it or not. He went to jail because he defrauded his investors. That's illegal. It's not illegal to screw customers over. So just know that that's how that works in the real world. So like the whole EpiPen thing that came up a couple years ago, if you guys remember that, that's the same thing. You can charge what you want for an EpiPen as a drug company. There's no law that says you can't charge $1 million for an EpiPen. Now, no one would buy it for that. But if you're only a manufacturer of it and you increase the price from $200 to $600, it's going to cause a pretty big ripple in the economy, especially with something like that that people buy every year usually. So anyway, just some little economics about fun things there. Online pharmacies do exist. The good ones are connected through a legitimate entity, like CVS has an online distributor, Walgreens has online delivery, Amazon is rumored to be getting into pharmacy in some capacity. Who knows how that'll work out? Everyone's kind of scared of that. What isn't legit are pharmacies that are telling you you can fill something without a prescription. And some people will say they order from these just because it's cheap, or, oh, it's based in Canada. Do you need a prescription? No. I don't know if that's really based in Canada. It's probably a counterfeit. It's probably adulterated product. It's probably not real. So just tell patients if they're using these sources, they really shouldn't be. If the cost is an issue, there's other ways we can work with them.
Question.
Yeah.
So the online pharmacy for CVS, wouldn't that be legit?
Yes. So those, yeah, if it's through like, yeah, a normal company that's a licensed pharmacy provider, usually, yeah, that's fine.
Like a random.
Or like through your insurance company, some people fill through like, some insurance companies will have like a national mail order center somewhere in the United States that fills a majority of their scripts. And they might want you to use that because they get a lot of synergy if they're working through a big distributor like that versus having little stores out there. So sometimes you see that happen. But yeah, that's legitimate. It's the one, again, they're going to require prescriptions and proof and things like that. And oftentimes they'll make you go to a store for your first prescription, and then you can do your refills online through an online delivery system. That's pretty common too. So yeah, that's the big difference is, do they require a prescription or not? Drug references, there's a couple that I really like and some that probably aren't as useful for you. The two that I use the most are Micromedics and Up to Date. Micromedics is a good detailed drug monograph. It's got a lot of detail about adverse drug events. It talks about literature behind why things are like, why things might be a certain prevalence in a certain population. So if you're like, well, this causes, you're looking at a side effect profile, and you're like, oh, this causes, I don't know, GERD in patients or dyspepsia or something like that. Well, what percentage was that in? What studies showed that? And that'll have all that on there. It's a little bit cumbersome to work through. Up to Date is probably the one everyone likes the most, I think. It's a really good, I think of it like a Wikipedia for healthcare. You can type in whatever you want to it. And Up to Date links to a drug monograph database called Lexicomp, and it's very reliable. So Lexicomp used to be very subpar compared to Micromedics, and now they're actually pretty on par, I think, as far as what I've seen. So I use Up to Date mostly, and Lexicomp, that's my personal choice. I have it on my phone. If you have most large health systems have subscriptions to these programs. If you work, I don't know about other places, like if you worked at a smaller clinic or something like that, you might have to pay for it yourself. I think it's worth it to have something. You could do like Hippocrates, which is free. Hippocrates has a pay version too, which is a lot more detailed. The free version's okay. It's going to tell you like what a drug is, what's the average dose, and what you use it for. That's basically it. So if you really just want the basics, Hippocrates isn't all that bad, and it's legitimate. It's not false information. It's just if you need more detail than that, you're not going to use it. You're not going to want it. You're going to be disappointed with its service. The Sanford Guide is, I've got that here. It comes as a little book, but you can get it online now, and I think there's an application for it as well. It's the best for antibiotics. It's got a lot of different treatment guidelines in there. It's got these great tables that show you drug and bug and compare the spectrums of activity. So if you're like, oh, my culture is growing C. diff, this patient's allergic to, or the stool culture is growing C. diff, patient's allergic to the vancomycin, first-line therapy. What else covers C. diff that I know? Maybe you don't remember. So that has all the stuff in it. It's really handy, especially if you're starting out and you work in a lot of infectious disease. It's a really great reference just to bounce things out. Eventually, you'll figure out your local resistance patterns and you'll kind of get that down. But for starting out, especially in the student world, it's super handy. Natural Medicines Database is like it sounds, it's for herbal products. It talks about what people use herbal products for. It talks about side effects of herbal products and things like that. Some other resources, I talked about Medscape. Medscape's a good just topics. It has lots of different articles that are really valid. It's a good one to look at. It's a free subscription. Global RPH is something that has different calculators on it. So if you're wondering how to calculate certain things we talk about in this class, you can use Global RPH. It looks like a really sketchy site when you go on it. There's lots of weird ads and stuff, but it actually is pretty legitimate. And obviously there's lit searches and guidelines available that are usually public and easily accessible to use. So lots more out there, but those are the ones I personally use or prefer. All right, let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and talk about kinetics.